Yo, what up? It's Nathan here, and today I want to show you the 3 major ways that you can engineer a psytrance rolling bass line. It's pretty hard to get that smooth bass line, so we're going to show you some techniques ranging from easy all the way to advanced to get that rolling bass line kick bass relationship just tucked in nicely, get something powerful, get something that doesn't take a bunch of headroom because you put too much bass in there and put too much sub in there. Major problem. Then after that, we're going to be showing you how to use an oscilloscope to really clinically get the perfect kick-bass relationship with just your eyes. This is one of the few things where you really can use those 2 eyes to get a perfect sound. And if you stay with us all the way to the end of the video, you're going to see a really cool compositional sort of hybrid mix technique that you can use to actually get a really nice kick-bass relationship. And I learned this from Dayton watching one of his videos. He's an amazing psytrance producer. If you don't know who he is, I don't really know what you're doing here. But yeah, we're going to show you all that cool stuff. There's a lot of really cool gems. These are all the different ways that you can mix a psytrance bass, ranging from just single layer mixing, working with just one single bass instrument, all the way up to the more common technique of working with 2 layers, a sub layer and a top layer. So if you stay with us, we're going to dive into the computer over there, and we're going to have a pretty fun time mixing. This is a tutorial I really wish I had when I first started, and I hope that you find the same value that I got from it while making it.
Hopefully you've got a 6.5-inch speaker or larger, or a sub. That will really make this a lot easier to tell, because you really want a full range system to get to the bottom of things here. So I'm going to play you the track, and then halfway through we're going to solo the kick and our bass as it currently is, and then we're going to start dissecting things and really explaining how it was put together. Let's go ahead and play that now. So let's just jump into the top layer. Right here, the top layer is brown, the sub layer is black, and so the top layer, it's a pretty simple setup here. It's just your simple saw wave with the phase locked at somewhere, so it repeats each time that saw wave hits. It sounds exactly the same. Inside of Spire, make sure you have Ana turned off, and also make sure you have Drift turned off, or each one of those basses could sound slightly different, and that could actually mess with your sub layer, which we'll actually explain in a moment here. So the typical sort of arrangement when you're using a top layer and a bottom layer is you high pass between about 120 hertz and 140 hertz with a 12 to 24 dB octave slope. You'll notice I added a little bit of a boost at the cutoff point, and that's typically because when you're cutting off with a high pass filter, you tend to find that it makes the frequencies near the cutoff a bit anemic. And that's simply because you can actually just see it on the shape here. Even though we're at 146 with a cutoff, it's already sloping down over here at around 250 hertz. So we're losing a little bit of energy there. So we can just gently restore it and even amplify that range. Since we've high passed it, that can sound very good by just turning that Q up a little bit, just within reason. Don't overdo it. It's very easy to overdo. Typically 0.10 should be enough to get that to sound right. So once you've got your top bass, it'll sound like this. Right? If we remove this EQ, it's just going to be the original bass as it was. That can present a few problems in terms of how it mixes with our, with our kick. So we just sort of do it this way, and then we layer a sub under there, because it allows us to create a surgical pocket, sort of where our kick is going to sit in the 80 to 120 hertz range, where the punch of our kick is going to sit. Because as you can tell, the kick that we have is very thin. There's nothing happening in those sub frequencies inside of it. You listen to it by itself, it sounds awful. Right? If you look at the EQ here, it's high passed with an 18 dB per octave at 85 hertz. The ideal range for sort of any kind of kick bass relationship where your kick is occupying the higher frequencies and is providing no sub, because your sub is meant to dominate with your bass, your kick is going to be high passed in the 80 to 100 hertz range. The higher you can get away with it, the better. Again, you'll notice that I've applied a little bit of a Q here, and that's just because, again, it makes a kick sort of anemic when you just high pass it. If there's not already a ton of punch inside of it, you're going to want to make that up with a little bit of a Q boost. And so I'll show you the kick without the Q boost, and it'll sound very anemic. And we'll play it with the bass actually, and then we'll add that back in. Just gives it some nice punch, you know, just a little bit of nice punch in there, which is good. And so let's go back to our sub layer. It's kind of the most important layer. The way that we accomplish the sub is it's the same exact sound in Spire. Now there's a few things you need to be aware of here. First and foremost, we just duplicated the instrument to another track, so we have a copy of our original sound. The thing about layering that original pluck sound underneath a top version of itself, as we have arranged here, is that even though the sort of amp envelope decay, which is what we're looking at here, is actually longer on the original sort of sound. So if we pull up the original, this is our top bass here, and this is our bottom bass. If we compare the amp envelope, you're going to notice I shortened the decay on the sub. The sub here has been shortened. The reason for that is because the bass, when it plucks, isn't going to sound as plucky. If we leave this nice and open, which we'll show you in a moment, you'll notice the bass just sort of becomes like a sustained bass layer. And that's just because bass energy, once it comes out of the speaker, it actually takes longer than higher frequencies beyond 100 Hz and higher. It takes longer for those sub frequencies to decay. And you want to create the effect of a sub plucking. So the way that you do that is you actually shorten the decay of the amp envelope so that it's comparatively shorter than your top envelope. So if we actually bring this back to, let's see what the value of this is at. It's at 540 on our top layer. So let's go ahead and put this back up to 540, or as close as we can get. So there we go, 40. And just listen to the bass, and then we're gonna undo that sort of decision that we made. Actually, let's just solo the bass first so you can hear it. If we solo the bass right now, it's gonna sound very sustained. And if we undo that, it becomes much more plucky. Right? It's pretty simple stuff. If you listen to it with the bass top, we'll bring it back to 540, and then we'll put it back down to its original. And you'll hear how it just gives it a nice sort of, it just gives it better drive because the bass is actually diminishing in time. And that's something you have to account for. So let's just do that and we'll listen. It just gives it a nice tighter thing. That's one of the most important things that you may want to sort of do. Is it going to make a huge difference in terms of how your side, trance bass turns out? I would say no. However, it's something that's nice to have as a means of controlling the sort of temporal and amplitude characteristics of your bass. Let's go ahead and have a look at the sub layer now. I've EQ'd it. It's fundamentally, it's the same sound. If we solo it and remove this filtering, it's the same plucky sound. Right, so it's the same sound. So what we do is we just run it through an EQ. Now there is a few really cool things here that you got to pay attention to. With this EQ, you're low passing at around 80 to 100 Hertz. I would suggest you get by with about 85. Don't let it go over 100. It's going to sound weird. And then of course you remove some low frequencies from 30 Hertz and lower. You just don't need those in sub. It's taking up precious headroom in your mix. One caveat to EQing a sub, and this is something that I would strongly recommend that you get in the habit of, is if your EQ has a linear phase mode, you'll want to activate that. Inside of equilibrium, you have to go from IIR to FIR, then put it in linear mode. So that way you get a when you low pass your sub, it doesn't change the shape of the actual frequencies that you're getting, because you essentially want to get a sub waveform, like a sine wave of some kind. If you're using a regular basic bitch EQ, which normally works for everything very well, when you get down to those low frequencies, it can change the phase relationship of your sub if you don't have it in linear phase mode. And this is a big problem, because if the phase relationship is not maintained between your sub and your top bass layer, and that was something that was very important, which was one of the main motivating factors for literally duplicating our original layer down and then filtering it. If you can't maintain that phase relationship between them, when they do happen together, something's going to sound a little bit off. It's not going to sound as good as it could. it's going to lose a little bit of drive. And you would think that you could avoid it by just being really aggressive with low passing or just using a just separate sublayer, using like a sine wave inside Serum. But I've tried that. It doesn't work. It causes much more headaches than just doing this. So that's sort of the more complex way of layering a bass. And we end up with sort of this sort of thing happening here, which wasn't that. So you get that. The other way that you can go about working with your sub is you can actually keep this top layer. And this is going to be a less sort of time consistent layer. It's going to be much more an extension of your kick. And it's much more of a driving sub layer effect that you can also do with a side bass. And this is actually the original one that I had settled on. And it's essentially just this. If we play it with our kick, it essentially is going to sound like it's an extension of our kick. And if you listen to that, you can actually hear a pop in our sub, which is obviously coming from the amp envelope here. That should be around 10 milliseconds inside of Serum. That'll get rid of those pops we were hearing. There we go. Not terribly important. Inside of a dense mix, people aren't going to hear that, but it could affect your low end in some way. So you just get rid of that with a little bit of attack. So all that's happening with our sub layer is it's your typical sort of offbeat arrangement that you would have with a kick. If you go up here and you look at this kick at the same time, our kick is in the green, our sub is in the dark blue, even though it's supposed to be black. This is a track that was written in triplets. So what I have done here is the kick happens and then your sub happens right after. Now, what I've actually done is you want to time it so that the sub happens on preferably some sort of rhythmic notation. So right here it's just happening right on the second eighth triplet. And then we actually cut it short here. Now the reason I cut it short is because I want the sub to diminish a little bit right before that kick comes in. It's going to allow that kick to have a little bit more punch. It's also going to amplify the driving effect of the sub layer because it just gives it a nicer groove. So I actually want to show you this on an oscilloscope because it's kind of important to see this. So what we're going to do is we're actually going to show you the sort of relationship between your kick and your sub because it's kind of important to know how they behave. So if we just solo our kick, you'll see it pop up on this oscilloscope. So what we're concerned about when we're working with any kind of clinical bass like this, as we would be in most dance floor tracks, the part that becomes problematic is essentially that our sub bass comes in somewhere between here and here. And you pretty much want this to be done by the time your sub bass comes in. So if we were to play our sub bass and we were to look at it on this, we would actually see that it comes in at some point later, probably around here. So there's going to be a little bit of overlap between the sub bass and our kick. So if we play them together, you'll see that they come up. So you can actually see that in my track there's some phasing problems happening. How do I know this? Because you can actually see that this waveform is not consistent. It's not staying very consistent. It's consistent over here, but somewhere in here it's going up and down. We have phasing happening. So what we should do is we should actually shorten this kick because we want this waveform to really be as consistent as possible once it comes in. And so this kick, as we discovered earlier, was actually going from about here, I would say here to here. It's actually a few milliseconds too long. So what you want to do is you want to we can visually play with it. This is really cool. So it's actually too long. So what we can do is we can go into our original sample and we can just shorten this end tail right here until it gets that sort of position that we want. Let's look at the relationship between our kick and our bass now. I mean, this is as surgical as you can get. The fact that I'm mixing with an oscilloscope is very surgical. I usually mix by ear, but you know, if you really want that thing to drive as hard as you can on a festival system, which is massive, being this kind of surgical is going to give you your maximum bang for your buck. So let's play that now with a sub. See how much more consistent that was than before? Look at that. We pretty much only have the beginning cycle, and that could be attributed to the amp envelope, right? This is the sub right here, just rising up. You have a little bit of distortion down there because the curve is being changed. That's fine. You really just want these first ones to be sort of smoothed out. So this first one's a little bit low. We could surgically account for that if we wanted to, but at this point, I would say that I have succeeded because everything after this first one is really super, super consistent. If I wanted to make it even more surgical and see if we could fix it, we could try that again. Come up to our kick, shorten it even more, which, you know, could cause some problems, but let's just see if we can do it. Let's bring up our oscilloscope. So you can actually see how I was shaping it in real time. In real time, I was sort of messing with the sine wave frequency at this point where the kick started crossing over into our sub waveform. You don't have to be too clinical with it. Just get a good oscilloscope. I got this one. It's called Oscillos Megascope. It's $40. It's better than the one that I had access to. Just really helpful to have access to that. All right, so let's get into the final way that you can do this, the OG way that's not as complicated that you can engineer a bass line. And that's just to keep your original saw wave and just use the entire frequency spectrum of your original bass sound without having to split it up into frequencies. So we're just going to play this, and I'm going to show you the sort of single layer EQ technique, which is just this. We're going to play these together. So again, we cut those low frequencies. I did it at 40 hertz because I'm sort of, you can make a bass sound a little bit more driving when you cut out those low frequencies that it just doesn't need because it doesn't go that low and the fundamental's higher. In this case, the fundamental of our bass is going to, it's at about 65, 70 hertz. In that case, you can cut around 40, you'll be fine. It gives you more headroom, your track can be louder, your bass is going to drive harder because it's actually going to have more presence. It'll sound punchier, which is really cool. So the other thing I do is a thing I'm a big fan of. I will do a dip around where I think the punch of my kick is, and I will try to execute the dip between 75 and 100 hertz. I don't like going lower than that because obviously, as we just mentioned earlier, our fundamentals around 65 hertz, so we want to stay away from that. It's okay if your EQ dip goes a little bit into it, that's fine. This is just designed to give your kick a little bit more space. If we go ahead and we A-B it without it on, you're going to hear how the kick doesn't really punch through as well. And then we'll turn it on. You'll hear how it just gives it a little bit of space to breathe. Again, since you're dealing with your bass, I would strongly suggest you put it in linear, your EQ in linear phase mode. It's going to make those EQ cuts a lot more surgical and precise. And bass is the one place you should do it. Everywhere else, it doesn't really matter. It's just with bass, you do have to be surgical. You can wait till the end of Mixdown to do that if you want to make sure that things are more in sync. If it causes you issues when recording and everything, that's fine. Not a big problem there. So that's pretty much how we've engineered the bass in the track. There was one other thing I wanted to go over, which is the sidechaining of all these basses. They've all been sidechained. This bass just has FabFilter Pro C2, which I use for sidechaining. And it's stucking about, I think, 6 dB or 9 dB. And that just helps it drive a little bit better. And the only point of this particular sidechaining on this bass layer is it's just to help it sort of rise in a little bit better in the mix. And that's just because the bass is actually plucking on every kick. So that is one sort of thing just to be aware of, is since the bass here is plucking on every kick, theoretically it would be better to actually work with a separate bass layer where the bass wasn't playing on the first note, which is actually what we've accomplished over here with the sub layer. One common technique that some people will fool around with is they will actually just completely mute the first bass note and only have the ones after the kick playing. What will happen is it'll sound like this without the kick. And then you have the kick. That is a very Psytrance specific technique. for handling bass frequencies, because you really don't want two different like basses coming together at the same time. And because our kick is happening here, and no matter how much we high pass it, there's going to be a little bit of frequencies there that can cause problems. So you have that choice. In this particular case, I didn't go with muting that, and it sounded fine to me at the time. That means I'm relying on heavy side chaining here to make this stay out of the way. And you'll see that we have the same side chaining happening here as we do on the top layer. It goes a little bit deeper, I think. And that's pretty much how we've gotten that to sort of sit in. So then you wind up with this whole sort of track arrangement. So one of the things to keep in mind with Psytrance, when you're mixing in this sort of very clinical way, your kick is going to sound pretty anemic. You're not going to like your kick. If you do, that's great. I actually like the kick because I know how it would sound when I pump up the volume or it gets on a bigger system. You got to realize that when you go to a festival or any kind of big event where they have a huge sound system, that little tiny kick is still going to sound massive on a big system. It's still going to have punch. It's still going to thump a little bit, but you really want those sub frequencies being driven by your bass layers. And that's one of the challenging things with mixing sub is unless you have a sub bass, an actual like separate sub in your system, it's pretty hard to check. If you have an 8-inch woofer, you should be fine for checking that, but a lot of people tend to mix, including myself, on 6.5 inches because they tend to just be a lot clearer from 100 hertz up. And mine are fine for checking the bass as long as I get up and stand in the back corner of the room. Anyway, so that's just something to keep in mind. I hope that had sort of helped you in some way get a really good understanding of how to engineer sub basses. If you have any questions, go ahead and leave them below. This is a very technical thing. So hit that subscribe button if you found this useful, and we will see you guys in the next video.